Welcome to the Sad Dad Games podcast, where we break down everything there is to love about the saddest and daddest games out there. I'm Shan.
I'm Eric.
Luke.
I'm Tucker.
We will start our discussion with the quintessential Sad Dad game, The Last of Us Part 1. We need to figure out why this game is GOAT. We're going to go over the prologue and Act 1 of The Last of Us Part 1, pulled off of thelastofusfandom.com, just to give a credit to the people that aggregated this information. It would be unfair to people who have created content to just take it from
We're
them.
so responsible.
Oh yeah, 100%. Gotta credit these people. Yeah.
Joel, a single father living in Austin, Texas, with his 12-year-old Sarah. Tucker, where did you live in Texas?
Austin.
It was Austin. All right, so this
What?
is relevant to you. We're going to have to come back to that.
Is this autobiographical?
We had no idea the whole game is about Tucker. Yeah.
Yeah, it really came up to you. It was 2011 that I was there. And yeah, single father handling a zombie outbreak.
You were there for that. I was unaware. All right. On the night of Joel's birthday, a sudden outbreak of a very severe brain infection originating from an unknown fungus rapidly spreads to the United States. As Joel and Sarah meet up with his brother Tommy, they attempt to flee the area. Joel and Sarah are briefly separated from Tommy as the latter keeps the infected at bay. Joel and Sarah continue to flee and they encounter a lone soldier who is ordered to open fire on them. He does. Joel and Sarah fall down a hill, separated from each other by only a few feet. When the soldier is about to execute Joel, he is shot in the head by Tommy. The soldier, not Joel. That would be ridiculous way
Game
to
over.
have a false start.
Story ends here.
Game over. Short game. Super emotional for like 15 minutes and then it's just done. Yeah.
To be fair, my first time playing through it, I definitely didn't get all the way to the soldier before. I'd already died like 6 times in the game. I had gotten eaten by at least 6 zombies.
We're trying to be their friends.
I didn't know where I was going, okay?
Were you trying to perform the kiss that was in the show? Like you wanted to see how realistic it was?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was
So-
feeling the rumble in my controller and I was hearing this voice over my left shoulder going, ugh, and I thought, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's turn around and look at that. Died at least 6 times doing that same maneuver.
I was playing this segment of the game to get ready for this. I did the exact same thing. I kept turning around to be like, I wonder if you run slower backwards. You super
die.
You run slower backwards. If you try to go through that sequence backwards and see what's going on behind you, you die every time.
But I wanted to see everything
It's
going
naturally
around.
impulse in Eric every game he plays.
There was so much detail in that sequence. I wanted to watch that guy who runs out of the burning building and he's screaming. And Sarah says, there are people on fire. And I was like, oh no, I want to watch the people on fire dead. And I wanted to take time in that segment because there's so much going on. I don't know if any of you were playing on the game mode where you have to totally restart every time you die, but that would be a terrible idea with this game.
It's for hardcore people only. No, but I want to speak a little bit to this. So I started playing the remastered PS4 version, played through the prologue and the first chapter. And then I was like, I want to play the remastered one because I didn't want to go buy it. So I played through the first 2 chapters, the prologue and the first chapter, and then I played through them again on the remastered or the remake version for PS5. The part of the beginning where Joel is in that desperate situation with his daughter, you play it on the PS4 version and it's hugely impactful and it really gets you. And then I played it again on the PS5 and it brought tears to my eyes just like when I was playing it for the first time. It's a hugely, intensely emotional moment. Watching it reimagined on the PS5 was really incredible and incredibly emotional. And that scene never gets any easier. It's hard to muscle through.
Yeah, thank you for restoring the heart of that scene. But now we're going to jump ahead 20 years.
Yeah, I just want to say that is like the difference between the remade version for the PS5. Like I've said it 1,000 times, just the subtle differences, especially in the motion capture, is just it just adds another layer of emotion through all the cutscenes in a very awesome story-driven game.
And it's like the micro expressions, especially around the eyes, the amount of expressions being captured for the animation data.
And I can't speak to the OG because I never played the OG version on PlayStation. I only played the remastered version. So I came into The Last of Us way late in the curve. But the other thing, I know we're going to jump ahead to the next part of the summary in a second. But the other thing about that opening sequence that really gripped me emotionally, I really think the audio immersive environment was doing amazing work from the get-go when she answers the phone. The detail in the sound design of her grabbing the phone and picking it up and talking to Tommy, all of that kind of stuff, those little details before she ever leaves the bedroom, that kind of stuff already had me in the world. And I'd watched the TV show and I knew the story and I'd done research before I played it the first time. But all of the little tidbits of sound design, everything from, I mentioned like the zombies shouting from behind you, that whole opening sequence, all of that makes it extra terrifying and makes it extra personal. And I don't think with as much detail in the sound design, I would feel as personal about the character in that moment. Like when you die and the player pees themselves a little or screams out loud, it's really effective, probably not just because they care about the character, but they take ownership of the character. And that immersive environment has as much to do with them feeling like they're actually there because of the sound design as it does with the graphics and how beautiful their facial expressions are and all of that. It makes it very personal.
It's a game you have to play with headphones.
Totally.
It makes a world of difference. Yeah. I 100% agree with that. That when you're hearing the zombies behind you, there's even one part where they use lighting that's like being cast from behind the character, and you can see the shadows in front of you of the things that are behind you chasing you, and their growls coming from behind you. It's an incredibly effective moment in a marriage of sound and visual design that really just, chef's kiss. Incredible.
I hadn't considered this, like the artistry behind that scene where you're first meeting the cordyceps zombies and they're chasing you through the town. Do you think that they had that explosion so that they could cast directional light so that they could use shadows to scare you forward?
For the remake, I bet 100% they did, because I don't think it was present in the PS4 version, at least not the same. The shadows are not always directionally accurate to the light source. But that was one of the differences I noticed in the PS5 version, and particularly right before you go down to the area where your watch gets shot and where Sarah dies when the soldier shoots you. You're running out of this gas station or store. I forget exactly where Tommy stays, and then you and Sarah just run down. And there's like a spotlight being cast behind you, and you're getting chased by two infected, and you can pretty clearly see the shadows of them. Like it just feels like they're right on your heels.
With the lighting of the explosion, because I had played this game before a couple times, the original version, and the first moment that my breath was taken away was when the lighting immersed the city with this like warm, dreadful glow that just felt like you were in an inferno. There was just dread that controlled the entire city, and you felt like you couldn't escape it. It's like the environment that was created by that, it was inescapable.
Lighting and a combination of really good lighting, good art direction, sound design. The prologue section of that game is very clearly crafted to make you feel certain things. I think it's cool that we're all picking up on different elements that created those feelings, because I think it's all incredibly intentional. Nothing in that intro is done by accident. It's all to create a certain something.
Reflecting on all these games I played, it's hard to find a game that starts off 0 to 10 so well of getting you emotionally drawn in. And I love all these different, very intentional elements that you've all talked about of, just being sucked in from the very beginning. And then, the game, even the show does this really well. It kind of starts off, there's this happiness. You start with sharing, celebrating Joel's birthday. It's a happy situation. We start at 0, we're happy. And then there's this nice progression all the way to 10 with the soldier when Sarah gets shot. Now we're in the Last of Us universe.
And shout out to the voice acting. Like when Sarah gets shot and she's dying, she's laying there bleeding out. The voice acting is unbelievable right there. The sounds of her struggling to breathe and her filling up with blood, all of that stuff. I got actual goosebumps just reliving that moment. It's not only horrifying and definitely evocative, but it's so scary good from a voice acting perspective. It's so scary specific. I totally agree with you, Tucker. 0 to 10, I don't know of another narrative storyline that does it so well, that makes you care about these people and then devastates you in such an effective way in the first 10 minutes of the game.
It's the video game equivalent of the intro to Pixar's Up.
Oh,
where I went there. The biggest emotional roller coaster in cinematic history within the time that they accomplished it, taking you from this deep love and passion and joyful life that these two had together, to just that all being robbed from him, you feel that devastation. Even if as a kid I felt it, despite having not experienced a relationship like that. And that's just the craft of good storytelling and good directing and good acting. And that's
100%.
exactly what The Last of Us did. It took all of its cues from Pixar, and they're like, all right, how do we do this with zombies?
Yeah, I don't know if you guys thought about this, and maybe a side effect of being a new dad is my thought was, okay, Sarah dies, shit is still going on around them. Like, is he just going to leave Sarah, leave her body there and get out of Dodge? And now in the game, you just cut to 20 years later. But putting myself in Joel's shoes, it's, oh, what do you do in that situation? You still have zombies around you. You still have the military that is cleansing all of Austin, and
I'm
bombing
not
it.
going to get into specifics because if there is an audience, they won't need to know. But having been in the situation where you are in the presence of someone who is dying, and like the grief that envelops you and then paralyzes you, there really is no outside world when that's happening to you. He's conveying this through a character moment that even I can't relate to personally. But I think at that moment, what is unsaid and realistically the only way he could have survived that moment is if Tommy stood up as a brother and said, I'm going to go get the truck and I'm going to go save my brother because he's not going anywhere without.
There's tons of good storytelling there too that they do without having to spell it out for you. They leave it to us, the player, to fill in those blanks because we jump 20 years later. And like you were talking about, Shan, if you're Joel and you're in that moment, the paralyzing grief and fear and just the cocktail of emotion going over you in that moment, if you don't have someone looking out for you, if Tommy's not there, who knows if Joel has any of the strength and any of the ability to survive that moment. We learn when we jump 20 years later, oh, Joel is the ultimate survivor. Of course he is. But in that moment, before the time jump, all of those questions are present and very real. If Tommy's not there with a gun to get him out of there, I don't know how Joel, even being the ultimate survivor, gets out of that moment alive.
I think Joel being the ultimate survivor later on, I think this is the defining element for that, is because his entire world was his daughter. As that's now stripped away, so Joel, I think, stops being Joel, and he becomes Last of Us Joel. So he stops being the dad, construction worker Joel, and becomes survivor Last of Us Joel that we know so well. And I think there's some big character changes and character flaws that we find out later on in the game.
There is like an interim moment that hasn't been discussed yet. There is a moment where Joel considers taking his own life because his life has bottomed out. There's nothing left for him and he considers suicide. There's a moment between the grief and turning it to anger that kind of gives him new purpose, even if it's hollow.
It's just, there's this beautiful little detail when we do jump 20 years ahead and Tess comes in the room and she immediately pours herself like a shot of whiskey and she asks Joel, do you want some? That killed me too, because it told me a lot about maybe Joel's survival and also giving more hints about that whole, if Joel has contemplated ending his existence, ending his own life at that point. That whole, like, it's morning time, obviously. The sun is streaming through the windows. This is not someone who's living their best self, bestie, and having the most optimistic future. Woohoo. They're not manifesting gratitude. They're like getting by with a shot of whiskey for breakfast. That gives you a whole ton of context, I think, too, about the time lapse and about where his state of mind is at now.
Morning drinking, you're immediately looking to kill your emotions for the day. You're trying to preempt them before they come.
There's no life.
That's the world they live in. They're trying to escape.
Okay.
They're always trying to escape.
Well, I think one of the other cool things is it's really easy to dwell on the loss of Sarah. That's the crux of the intro. I think there's a lot of other cool little character moments, particularly for Joel right at the beginning. The one part that stood out for me, particularly this last time playing, is when they get in the car and they start driving to try to get out of town. They see that there's like a family, like two people and a kid. And Tommy goes, let me pull over and see what they want. Joel goes, what are you doing? They've got a kid. Joel goes, so do we. Keep driving. Someone will come along. This is before any apocalypse has happened. Joel hasn't been hardened yet, but you get to see that glimpse, which is why I think he survived so well in the apocalypse, is because part of it had already been hardened. I wonder what's happened to this point in Joel's life that made him look at a family with a child and be like, whatever, I'm going to worry about mine and my own.
I think it's also just speaking to what I got from that scene is it was him just like implicitly describing how important Sarah was to him and that literally no one else matters. And
well, you see that before as well with the infected coming through the window in their house and Shan very little hesitation of killing this guy.
Just caps him without thinking about it, really. He tells him to stop. He gives him warnings and stuff, but like and then he shows almost no emotion. He shoots him and then turns towards Sarah and he isn't like, I should have shot that guy. Tommy does the same thing later. He shoots an infected in the alleyway and then all he says, he's dead, and they just keep running. It made me start thinking about Joel and Tommy. I don't think that they were killers before like the game started, but it's like they have some level of comfort.
And Joel, how much time has lapsed before you wake up as Sarah with the phone call when Tommy calls you, and after Sarah has fallen asleep?
That's a good point.
That whatever happens in those couple of hours, if you walk to the fridge, right, you see the note that Joel says, "I'll be gone," on the fridge. So Joel had left a note for Sarah that if she had woken up and he wasn't already home, that he said, "I was out of the house." So however much time lapses between her giving him the watch and saying happy birthday and her falling asleep and getting that phone call, I wonder what happens in that time, because Joel alludes to it in some of the conversations, the brief snippets we get, that he's already seen stuff in whatever space of time that Sarah was asleep. So even by the time we get to the family with a kid, I think whatever is part of Joel and Tommy's backstory and their character, whether they've seen violence and experienced it themselves growing up in the home or whatever their comfortability with it, I think there's also something that happens in that time when Sarah falls asleep and when she wakes back up that informs Joel, that maybe kicks in his instinct. So when he comes back into the house and he's ready to shoot the neighbor, some of that I think has already been activated.
Following the prologue, the game cuts to 20 years later in the summer of 2033. Joel is now a smuggler in a bleak, post-apocalyptic society in the Boston quarantine zone with his partner and friend, Tess, where they frequently sneak out of the city illegally to trade with other survivors. After coming back from a deal with another client, Tess explains to Joel that she was jumped on the way back from the deal by two men who had intention to kill her. The two set out to look for a local arms dealer named Robert who had stolen guns from them. When they find him, she confesses that he sold the guns because he owed them to the Fireflies. Angered by this revelation, Tess shoots Robert twice in the head, and the two decide to look for the Fireflies and explain what happened to retrieve their merchandise.
So basically a Ponzi scheme.
You're going to have to describe what you think a Ponzi scheme is. Is that not what it is?
Robert he's double dipping. Yeah, he's
not double dipping. So this is something that I had to look into because with my ADHD brain, I have realized, or I've always understood, and I didn't know it was ADHD at the time, that if something isn't shown to me on screen, I will not comprehend that part of the story, and I will just go for the visual beats. And it's a weakness. It's why I don't read books.
Books are dumb. Who reads books?
Don't read books, kids. If you're listening, only play video games. Don't read books.
If you were reading books, you should stop. Yeah.
Like reading comprehension is abysmal, but I did have to look into it. It's like really, I had to ask the internet to really explain to me the dynamic, what's happening behind the scenes. What happened is Joel and Tess had intended to sell the guns to Robert because they were just doing the regular smuggling nonsense. And they had already arranged for that trade and for payment. Robert then comes in and steals all of the guns from them behind their back and doesn't pay them. When Tess is out doing her own thing, she gets jumped by Robert's men who tries to kill her because they don't want Joel and Tess coming back to kill him for having stolen them.
You don't want Joel coming after you.
They make a much bigger point of that in the TV show. He told me to swear to secrecy. He doesn't want me coming with you. But she's like, that's what I want. So let's go do it. So it wasn't so much double dipping. The show does the double dip, right? They almost conflated the two because in the TV show, Robert has a battery that has died. And
Neat.
he is trying to sell it to both the Fireflies and to Joel and Tess. And he tries to make money from both of them. And that's when there's a scuffle with the Fireflies. Marlene gets hurt and Tess is there and she's like, oh, well, the battery was crap anyway. So what are we going to do? That's when the Fireflies offer, hey, we'll give you a car because we were going to do a mission that we now can't because we are hurt. And they're killing off all of our people. Well, the Fedra is, not Robert's people who are in the outskirts.
Video game Robert, he's trying to cover his own butt. TV show Robert's a little more sinister. He's smarter.
I don't know how he thought he was going to get away with the broken battery. He probably intended to kill the Fireflies anyway.
Yeah. Can I say though, I really appreciate this section of them coming after Robert from both a gameplay and a narrative perspective. I think in gameplay, I really appreciate a little bit of getting you grounded in the world before the proper adventure starts. The proper adventure being him meeting Ellie and going off, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think that giving us a little bit of a slice of life, which is it's a crazy like bonkers stuff going on, but that's Joel's slice of life. This is like his day to day. They're like, I gotta go get the guns he stole from us, and we're gonna kill some people. And I really appreciate getting that kind of glimpse into the day to day for Tess and Joel, so that we could see like where Joel is at now, what his life is like compared to what it was like before everything happened.
From a prologue perspective, there's already a 3-act structure, a beginning, middle, and end. And then you launch into the actual first act of the game. They have to reestablish status quo and then build up to the inciting incident. What I thought was interesting about the TV show is that Joel's motivation in the beginning of the game is simply to just live life as a smuggler and then to go after Robert. And then they just happen to come across the Fireflies. That leads to the inciting incident of coming across Ellie and needing to take her to Salt Lake. Whereas in the TV show, Joel has a motivation that lives outside of that. He's looking for Tommy. Now, we don't know why he's looking for Tommy, but I actually thought it was just really smart writing by the team to just help build mystery and something's broken with Tommy. You already know something about him, but something's wrong. And it just builds mystery and tension. That kind of was one of the key achievements of the TV show, is always leave you with a narrative thread that you had to keep pulling to get to the next episode. I never wanted to stop watching that show.
Yeah. And giving Joel the extra reason of needing to look for Tommy helped for me, his motivation and his exodus out of the city even more. Not that, I mean, as we're going to read and talk more about, not that the rest of the story and him learning about Ellie and what happens with Tess, not that all of that doesn't help his motivation to leave, but from the get-go, him having another reason, him having family that he's worried about, that he needs to hear from, that he needs to seek out, for whatever reason you don't know, gives Joel a whole lot more motivation, other than in the first couple minutes of this act where it's just, this is life in the quarantine zone 20 years later. It gives us a little bit more drive moving forward, rather than, like you said, it sets up that status quo. One more note about the status quo. When she shoots Robert twice in the head, right? Like such an effective way. You understand them killing the guys you reach up to Robert to get to Robert, because they also have guns and melee weapons. And so they're defending themselves in a way, even though they're the aggressors. They're also, there's a life. Yeah, it's a gray area. Yeah. But when Robert is down on the ground and he doesn't have a weapon and they're both on top of him, they've got a weapon and his arm is broken. Yeah. This guy is no longer a threat. And then for Tess to just shoot him twice in the head, total dispassionately, like, and this concludes our business, Cap. That's also really effective at setting up our status quo, life in the quarantine zone. This is how business gets done, and you're no longer of use to me. You can't provide me weapons or food. Cap. Move on.
And especially seeing Joel's reaction.
Yeah, what does outside of the quarantine zone look like? And then as playing through the rest of this game and then into part 2, that just gets exaggerated.
Or like Tess saying, those two guys, they were nobody. It doesn't matter. Those two guys that she ran into on the way to the apartment. Yeah, they're nobody. It doesn't matter. They're dead. Okay, sure.
Also, did you notice that like she lied about it to Joel? I'm curious what everybody's take is on this, because at the beginning she just said, I got in a scuffle with 2 men. Then when you are starting to encounter in the slums Robert's men, you overhear them say that Tess actually killed these two men, and she never told Joel that. Why do you think that she withheld that information?
I don't know if it's withheld. I would almost, given the
She
world
literally
building.
she literally shrugs at Joel after they say that. She's like, "I guess I didn't tell you."
Yeah, because I'm wondering if that was
I
just
didn't
so
notice.
commonplace for their business. Is
It just didn't matter. It was such a little detail that I killed him. Whatever, it doesn't matter. I don't know. I honestly
I
didn't
kill
think
people
about
every
that.
day, like
Didn't
in our
notice.
line of work. It's
Yeah,
just
what matters? Yeah.
details. Let's go get our guns back.
I wonder
Go
if
for it.
part of it too is when she comes home and she pours herself that drink, whatever. Joel looks pretty peeved with her, and I wonder if she just didn't want to bother him more. He seems pretty upset that she went and did this thing on her own because we had a drop off. We should have done it together. And it doesn't matter, whatever. I want to stop talking about it, quit drawing me, kind of a thing.
Well, I feel like it is actually underpinning a very important part of Tess's character that she uses Joel as a puppet and she's manipulative to reaching her own ends because he is the brawn and the muscle to achieving her goals.
Yeah, she does do that right at the end of Ellie too. That's a fair point. Whether intentionally or not, she definitely does do that.
I think she uses Joel, even though she appears to care for him. This is also an interesting point, right? Because in the game, it alludes to them having an equal level of some kind of love for each other, even if it isn't fully realized. In the TV show, what they do differently is Tess says that it's unrequited, that she is the one that cares for him, and he never actually ended up expressing that in return. And I actually thought that was interesting because at the end of the second episode, when Tess's life is taken, the differences between the game and the show was in the game, Joel finds out that she's been infected and she breaks a little bit. He's like, oh God, right? In the TV show, he doesn't express as much emotion and he recoils. It's because he doesn't feel the same way for her in the TV show version.
Yeah.
And I think it accomplishes two different things. In the game, she uses the somewhat equal amount of love they have for each other to convince him to be her proxy in taking Ellie to Salt Lake. In the TV show, he already has a reason to get out of town because he wants to find Tommy. And it also establishes with his character that there's no room in his life for love that was lost when Sarah was taken from him. In the game, there is room in his life for love. And I think it tells a different story because it says that there is room in his life and he has Tess, but Tess isn't fixing him. And it's saying that a partner, like having a spouse or having someone to love like that, isn't giving him fulfillment. And it's not fixing him and making him not want to be a smuggler or break all of these rules, unspoken rules now because society has collapsed. So it's not love that can do that for him. It's being a father. And only after he's able to find that in Ellie will he maybe be able to make that journey towards keeping the peace or being a peaceful person again.
I agree. No, I think that's a really interesting comparison between Joel in the show and Joel in the game, because I think that they're widely extremely similar, especially the first part of the show. It's almost a shot for shot of the game, but there are really subtle and important differences that I think that you just highlighted really well. I agree with all of that.
I want to delve into it more, but I don't want to spoil for our listeners the next part of the story before we get there. So we can go ahead and continue with
Well,
that.
let's go to the next part of the story then.
All right.
Next part of the story.
All right. I'm going to go back one sentence and then I'm going to continue forward. Angered by the revelation that Robert had sold their guns he had stolen, Tess shoots Robert twice and then they decide to look for the Fireflies and explain what happened to retrieve their merchandise. Shortly after, they encounter Marlene, the head of the Fireflies, and she tells them that she will part with the guns that Robert had sold to them to pay off a debt. She will part with those guns and double the payment if they agree to smuggle something out of the city for her. Then go to a Firefly safe house that Marlene takes them to, and it is revealed that they were smuggling a young girl by the name of Ellie. Tess and Joel split up, with Tess following Marlene back to her camp to confirm that she has their payment, and Joel escorting Ellie back to their own safe house to wait for Tess. When Tess returns, the three of them set off for a drop-off point. Other Fireflies will be waiting to receive Ellie at the Capitol building. Before they get far, however, two patrolling military members ambush them, and they are subject to a scan for CBI, which is a cordyceps brain infection. And they call for backup. Tess and Joel pass the CBI scan just fine, but just before they get a look at Ellie's scan reading, Ellie panics and she stabs the soldier with a switchblade. In true Ellie fashion, with her military upbringing in the Fedra. Going into combat, both Joel and Tess immediately kill both of them. It is then revealed that Ellie is infected, but Ellie claims that her bite is 3 weeks old, which is a unique condition as everyone turns within 2 days after being exposed to the fungus. Although still skeptical, which is in Joel's nature, the three escape together as backup arrives and they flee underground as soldiers pursue them. Once the soldiers lose track of them, Ellie explains that Marlene believes what happened to her may be the key to finding a cure. Joel is reluctant, but Tess believes there may be some truth to what she is saying, and she urges him to consider finishing the drop-off. The three fight their way through numerous infected all the way to the Capitol building, only to find that the Fireflies that were supposed to meet them have all been slaughtered. Joel declares they tried and failed and proposes that they return home, but Tess reveals that she had been bitten on the way to the building. Tess begs Joel to bring Ellie to Tommy, as he used to be a part of Marlene's group and may have an idea of how to bring her to the Fireflies. Tess stays behind alone to recover them against the approaching soldiers as Joel reluctantly flees with Ellie. And once they are in a safe spot and away from any infected, Joel tells Ellie to never bring Tess up and to keep their histories to themselves. He also tells her what to do and to do what he says when he says it. Joel makes Ellie repeat it, and she does. Then the subject is over. Joel tells his initial idea, which is to visit an acquaintance that owes him a favor and to procure a working car from him, which would make their trip to Tommy's a lot easier and quicker. So they do a little bit of foreshadowing when you are right on the cusp of reaching the Capitol building. There is a note that explains that somebody was trying to smuggle Frank into Fedra, into the quarantine zone. I don't think I had ever picked up that was the same Frank because I didn't have an attachment to a character I had never seen until I had seen the TV show.
Cool world building. Like it breaks down in detail how the cordyceps works and how they can tell. You find a document that says this is how the brain or the scan works. Like it goes in their ear and bubble. And then it's just cool to see the level of detail and effort that the developers put into making this world believable and be like, yeah, if someone was here, they would have left a note and it probably would have said something like this. And it's just an insane amount of detail. So read the changes the game.
Unseen story, which is just the part of the story that users have to choose to engage with, because they'll still get enough if they don't. But if you want to truly be immersed, because Resident Evil does the same thing, right? They just dump a bunch of notes everywhere so that if you want, you can be immersed. And admittedly, again, with my ADHD brain, I'll pick them all up the first time I play the game, scan them, get an overview, look for any codes to any safes, and then I'll move on. I'll never see the forest for the trees on how all of this is connected. And what I really like about this experiment that we're doing is that it's the first time I've ever had to be thoughtful about how everything is connected, both like in the narrative and in the lore. It's the most fascinated I've ever been in this world. And I'm picking up a lot of details that is really enhancing the story. And so I really hope that we can continue doing something like this from it because it's a lot more fulfilling. It's not just like a finish the game and move on. It's I appreciate the art, the artistry of all the devs and writers and everyone involved.
Something that I think we really glanced over was your first encounter with the infected. You're running into clickers, you're running into different types of enemies. There's mentions of like stalkers, which is a enemy you encounter later on. Just the enemy building is just so interesting of just the different types of enemies, how naturally they fit into this world of how when you're looking at plants growing, they're not all the same. There's different variations here and there. I think it's just really interesting where this is a fungus. What does that look like? A lot of zombie games, it's one zombie. You might get a super zombie every now and again. But I guess Resident Evil does this really well with the Ouroboros. You have your kind of base zombie, and then you have these bosses that are crazy and bigger, different sizes, and I just love how natural the Last of Us enemies fit into that world.
This is like a developer technique, right? You want enemy diversity, but you're also limited by what you can create with AI. And so you'll often get like a base that they probably worked on for a long period of time. And then like they have evolutions of that. Like maybe it's a zombie and then it's a zombie that's on fire and then it's a zombie that can run. And they're really just taking the same core AI and then they're just like adding a few extra pieces of functionality to say it's a different boss, but it's actually just economical to recycle what already existed. An example of this would be like Resident Evil 2. They had the stalker system with Mr. X. And in Resident Evil 3, they had Nemesis. And I believe they probably reused a lot of the same AI code from Resident Evil 2, but it's very rudimentary. It's just a man following you around then trying to hit you. Then Resident Evil, he's trying to chase you. He's using a rocket launcher. He has all of these evolved capabilities, but really it's built on the same thing that they started Resident Evil 2 and they just kept adding to it. It's brilliant.
Smart. No, I love that. To Tucker's point, I love that first building. So the first time I played The Last of Us was right around the time it came out. It was probably 2013, 2014. It was when it was a pretty new game. And at that point, I was like a young adult. I was fatigued and bored of zombie games because it's like everything's got zombies in it. And I had people tell me like, dude, you got to play this game. I'm like, I don't want to play another zombie game. So many times. And then I played it. And the first time I encountered the zombies, like, these are not zombies. They like on a very like surface level, they're zombies, but they're so much more contextualized than any other kind of zombies or infected monsters that I've ever come across. It's something is very clearly fantasy, but it seems so grounded. Where it's like while I was playing the game, I remember looking up and being like, man, could this happen? Because cordyceps mushrooms or cordyceps fungus is a real thing. They infect ants and stuff, those ideas. But I was looking up, I was like, could that happen? Are there cases of cordyceps infecting rodents and stuff like that? And it really just started stirring these creative things in my brain. Something that was happening in the game was affecting the way that I thought about things in real life to be like, could this be plausible in real life? And I love the enemy varieties from an artistic direction, the clickers. I love the way their faces open up. And, oh, man.
To your point on, can this happen in real life? My favorite part of the show, hands down, is the opening scene with the two scientists. And he's talking about viruses. And if it's a virus, we always end up winning. If it's a fungus, we lose. And there's no winning. And I just love that, just that fear that it drives. And like, to your point, Eric, it's like, yeah, in the show, it's, oh, what if global conditions change where cordyceps would have a reason to evolve into something that can inhabit a human. And that's what happens. Perfect way of putting in, okay, we have climate change going on. Temperatures are rising. There's this kind of innate kind of fear in the back of your mind of, oh, could this actually happen?
I want to speak to the artistry of that prologue with Jonathan from The Mummy, who is the only way I think about it. Everything is The Mummy and Brendan Fraser.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, as I call him, he's explaining cordyceps that are like as they already exist in our world. And so you're following along, you're like, okay, but I understand it's not a real threat because that does exist and this isn't happening. And then it builds up to a moment where what if they had to evolve and the world got a little warmer? You're like, oh, shoot, that's happening right now. And not only do they use like a music cue to like, they shush the audience and they bring in this like tension with the music, but you are hooked because you realize we are already on the side of this possibility. And so you are just as afraid as they are in their world because you think it could actually happen to you.
The way that they're able to make us as the watcher or the player feel immediately invested, like, oh crap, our Earth real right now is getting warmer. Are we going to become zombies? Are cordyceps going to evolve? They do that really effectively. In the game, I remember having this thought, like the loading screen where you see the spores come out of this side of the screen and gradually spread like the air is coming to you, and you feel as the player like you're going to inhale these spores any second. They do such a good job from the loading screen to everything else in the game to help you feel, again, more personally invested. I caught myself holding my breath during the loading screen just because I felt like if I'm going to inhale these spores and this is how it starts, and it's stupid and you know that it's just a loading screen. But even in the loading screen, those little details did a lot to help me feel personally invested and to make me feel like this was more real and the stakes were higher. The other thing about that, because it's like the theater person in me is always thinking about what these people's objectives are and what they need and why they're going to make those decisions because they need something, they have an objective, they have a tactic. And I was thinking back, we talked about this a few minutes ago when we were discussing the chapter summary where Ellie turns around, and stabs the soldier with her switchblade and it turns into them killing the two soldiers. Yep. But before the backup arrives, Joel in the video game is super adamant. He wants nothing to do with her after she showed her bite. Tess is the one who initially gives in and is open to the idea of entertaining that bite has been there longer than 2 days, that it's a 3-week-old bite. And then the backup arrives, and it's not Joel who ushers Ellie along with them and saves her. It's Tess. You'll notice in the video game, Tess is the one who immediately grabs Ellie and moves her away from the headlights coming, and they escape down that pit, and that whole sequence begins, rather than Joel. And in the video game, that makes a whole lot more sense, that Tess is the person who does that. Again, like Joel has other motivations. We've talked about his split motivations in the video game versus the TV series. But I was thinking a lot about that, just thinking that it's interesting that Tess is the one who immediately jumps on the idea that Ellie is more meaningful than just another infected person.
So I wanted to piggyback off that for one of my most important questions. If you think good writing means that literally everything is intentional and crafted, what does Tess do to the story? And I would pitch, oh, go for it.
Oh no, so I've been giving a lot of thought to this, of just what does Tess represent, and it's interesting playing the game alongside watching the show. I think there's some similarities between the Tesses, but I think there is a main. Well, I think the biggest similarity, I think Tess, in some aspect, especially when Ellie comes in the picture, when she reveals that she's bitten, that it's 3 weeks old, that she's possibly immune. Tess, I think, represents this hope of that humanity has of things getting better,
Yeah.
which Joel is completely devoid of. Joel has no home. He wants nothing to do with Ellie. He's heard this story a million times. It's what are we doing? This is putting our self-preservation in jeopardy, going after this false hope. But Tess grabs onto that hope, which I've been grappling with. Is that in character for Tess, or is this something new for Tess? Just her as a character in the background.
I think you're correct. And to put it the way that I think about it, is that Tess is a foil to Joel, his character, because really the dichotomy between them, but aside from like their similarities, they're pragmatic people who are smugglers, they're against the rule of law and all that stuff for their own benefit. But the true dichotomy and what Tess is doing for Joel is she is hope and he is cynicism. And we're going to see that Joel doesn't have hope. Oh, and he also mentions the luck will run out. And it just keeps getting back to this refrain of Joel doesn't see the light and he doesn't believe that there is anything greater to work towards. He is all about himself. And Tess is a foil because she's the one that keeps trying to pull him along. And then after Tess is lost, she tries to use the relationship they had to give him a proxy for hope that will help drive him to Salt Lake City on her behalf. Again, in the show, it's different because Tommy is his true impetus, it's his motivation. But at this moment, Joel doesn't have motivation because he just wants to go back home. He just wants to live a quiet life again. And he has to do this for Tess. And so she needs the optimism and the hope. So I think that's the true purpose of Tess.
Something that I noticed this time is we really see the relationship over the course of the game that we'll touch on more later. But over the course of the game, as you see how Joel and Ellie kind of come together as a team. So we see that as like Ellie sort of coming in to take the place of Sarah, not like, but in Joel's mind, like he loses his daughter and Ellie kind of becomes that person for him after he loses Sarah. But I also was thinking about like after Tess shows the bite, she sacrifices herself, and then Joel and Ellie have to go off, just the two of them. Joel pretty immediately starts, telling Ellie, do this, do this, do that. Like there's one part in particular where he like lifts her up to like go get a ladder for him in the section where you're swimming through the water. And I was just starting to think about like from a functionality standpoint where it's like Joel needs another person. If you think about it in the game, Joel, it's never just Joel with one exception. But at the beginning of the game, he's got Sarah and Tommy. In this part of the game, he's got Tess. And then once Tess is gone, he almost immediately kind of even subconsciously starts to lean on Ellie. Begrudgingly, he's not happy that she's there. He's not happy that he's got to do this thing that at the time is really like, I really don't want to do this. But even with all that, he needs another person. And so I think that part of the reason that Tess was in the story the way that she was to give another example of Joel having a hole in his life that needs to be filled by Ellie.
It's also that moment when he sees the bite, when Tess says, our luck had to run out eventually. In the video game, I feel like if Tess isn't against the wall and it's her death facing them both in the face, and if she wasn't the one who was really firm, we need to see this through with Ellie, Joel, I don't know that Joel saves Ellie's life. I don't know that Joel does anything with Ellie at that point. He could leave her to fend for herself. But at that point, if Tess isn't insistent, if she's not the one who insists that he has to look after Ellie, he has to see this through, I don't know that Joel sees it through. I don't know that Joel is at a point where he's prepared to take on someone who reminds him too much of the daughter he lost. Especially, I mean, there's that moment earlier in this episode, it's in this chapter, it's in this sequence, when they've just found out that she tests positive for CBI, that she's infected, where the two of them are talking to each other and Ellie's in the background and Tess turns to Joel and all she says is, I get it. And nothing more is said. Yep. But like those of us, we understand novels about Tess and Joel's relationship and how much Tess knows about Joel's feelings. That whole I get it. So I think if Tess isn't there, Joel doesn't save Ellie. They don't move on. In fact, if Tess isn't there, probably both Joel and Ellie die at the end of this whole affair. Neither of them stick together. They don't stick together. They don't survive.
I think what's interesting is I think that just shows Joel's motivation for living in this post-Sarah world, I think, is purely external. He's living for somebody else. He's not living for himself. We hear his suicide story later on. But just as somebody who has gone through depressions and have felt similar, suicidal thoughts, by the way, if anybody's doing that, get help. There's points where I'm like, when I'm watching the Shan playing the game, like, man, if I was Joel, I would not want to put up with this bullshit world. I would just end my life. Like, what am I doing? This is no way to live. But for Joel, it's Tess for a while. Then it turns into Ellie, and we move on from there. But it's just, I think, a really interesting character trait that Joel has. Joel's not doing a whole lot for Joel, in a sense. There's a self-preservation, but it's always driven by somebody close to him. Not necessarily just him. We see that his reaction when he sees Tess that got jumped in the show and the video game. She has like a cut eye, things like that. There's this rush to her defense to it and doing it for her and not necessarily for Joel.
To more deconstruct Joel and his character profile and what motivates him and who he is, I want to ask, story-wise and mechanic-wise, why was it important that a soldier pulled the trigger on Sarah? What does that do as a catalyst for Joel's character? And I had never considered that it was important who pulled the trigger. Then I realized it told a completely nuanced story about Joel, and I'm curious what other people's thoughts are about it.
I'll jump in. I think that it lends it a certain level of unimportance. Not that that wasn't an important and significant moment for Joel, but if it had been like one of the infected that got her, then that's just what was kind of happening around everyone. But And if it had been a neighbor trying to defend themselves, that's like almost an accidental happenstance. But it was a deliberate, like this guy was given an order to kill that man and that child. And so it bred this sense of, I feel like, injustice inside of Joel, which is probably a big catalyst for why he lives a little bit outside of the law.
This is exactly it.
He feels this distrust and disrespect for that organization because the reason his daughter is dead is because someone was following orders. And so he's like,
Right.
well, what good are these orders?
I was gonna say, I also think there's this level. Yes, I agree with everything Eric says.
Everything
This
forever. Tucker
level
has to agree with
forever, but there's this level of distrust in that situation with Sarah. Joel is looking for help. This is a institution. Soldier represents the army that is there to protect him and his daughter and his family and things that he holds dear. And all of a sudden that gets flipped. And that institution is now going to kill him and his daughter and take away things that he loves. And I think that distrust follows him throughout the whole series. See it with Fedra, why he lives outside of the bounds. What I think is interesting is it's not just I think distrust of like a military institution, is he distrusts the Fireflies as well. So I think it's turns into this distrust of all institutions, distrust of anything that promises to help me.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but in that initial news sequence, we get a bunch of headlines from the news in the video game, and it talks about Firefly. It mentions Firefly while the opening credits are rolling with the guitar for the first time.
With the excellent opening song.
Excellent opening song.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'll get back to the music in that because I do want to want to mention that. But we're getting headlines, we're getting little radio snippets about the organizations that emerge, about Fedra, about Firefly, and it mentions that Firefly in particular, they want to bring back government, they want to bring back society. And knowing, as Joel does, or feeling that distrust for organized government, for the military, for whatever form that takes. His daughter being shot by a soldier, I think if it wasn't already that he was raised in Texas and they're living in Texas and there's already this sociocultural ethos around it that don't tell me what to do. This is the Wild West. We live our life. Nobody tells me how to live my life. There's already that ethos around Texas. And then the fact that his daughter gets killed by the man, by a soldier, on an order. Any inkling that he might have to join up with a group, with a cult,
it's gone.
No religion, no government, no society. All of that has been shot out of him.
Well, I think that adds to the devastation of Tommy as his brother joining the Fireflies. There's that tension in that relationship now. And I think
they never. I might be wrong about this, but I don't think they ever explain why he's mad that Tommy joins. So you have to do the work to understand that Joel hates organizations. He hates institutions, and he thinks Tommy joining the Fireflies is a betrayal of the moment that he shared with Joel of Sarah being taken from him. It's like, the man took my daughter and you're going to go join the man, and I hate you for that.
Well, it's so interesting, like with that context as we get further in the game is when Tommy comes back into the picture, and as that relationship builds in a little bit of a different way between Joel and Tommy, and even into part 2, the role Tommy plays there, that's a lens I haven't looked at it through before. And so that just is a really interesting dynamic of just relationships in general, of their kind of have their ebbs and flows with them. I'm wondering if Joel ever really totally forgives Tommy, or if there's always kind of that little bit of betrayal that's always sitting in the back of his mind.
So good storytelling would demand that anything that's added to the story would add to the central thesis and theme of the story. And personally, I believe that the theme of this show is the sacrifice that love requires. And a secondary theme would be hope versus optimism, as is told in the shows like When in Darkness Look for the Light. And it's a hope that Joel doesn't have anymore because he doesn't have love in his life anymore. So I would love to build on, like, what is everything doing mechanically that is adding to this thesis? So, what do you think the characters of Fedra and the Fireflies do to this story? The Fedra is an organization that believes in ruling with an iron fist. It's an authoritarian like government establishment, and the Fireflies believes in self-determination and having a more of a democratic voice. And how does that lend itself to telling the story's thesis?
I mean, it's funny because this is an age-old question, right? I mean, throughout human history, we're always battling between authoritarian regimes or more authoritarian regimes, and then more democratic, more people-led, more self-actualizing governments, societies, organizations. And we talk about it right now in America. We're talking about it right now in lots of countries in the world. So it's kind of always relevant. This argument, this discussion about how people get a better future for themselves. I think it adds so much more to his Wild West style, but it also frames the world in that we still need to cooperate. We need to collaborate for humans to survive, especially in this zombie apocalypse. There needs to be collaboration and cooperation. There needs to be organization, whether that's through a man, an authoritarian regime, the man, or whether it's more of a self-determining democratic type of rule like the Fireflies are fighting for. It just puts Joel again as the outsider looking in, needing to collaborate, needing to cooperate to survive, needing Ellie, like you were talking about, Eric, needing Tess or needing Ellie, always needing someone, never really being able to get by completely on his own, but so unwilling to play within any of their rules, any of their structures. I think it adds to the desperation and the hopelessness of his plight. It creates the possibility that he'll end up being either victim or pawn, but never really the person who can pull any of the levers to determine his own destiny. It's really
Yeah,
interesting framing.
well, I
Yeah.
also, one way I want to think about it is that Joel starts in Fedra and he makes his way to the Fireflies in Salt Lake. I think that represents a symbolic journey of going from the institution that is based on cynicism to going to the institution that is based on hope. It maybe doesn't reflect where he ultimately aligns, but it represents where he's at as a character at the beginning and where he is trying to go as a character at the
Mm.
end.
So I want to go back to what you were saying, Luke, on Joel. He's never going to be the puppet master. He's always going to be the pawn. But it's interesting because that comes to a head at the end of the game, and Joel makes decisions that he is the puppet master, and
Spoiler
that
alert.
decision.
Spoilers.
Spoiler alert! But I think it's just really interesting
Mm.
that we're having that groundwork here. And to your point, Shan, is Joel's moving from this authoritarian cynicism to hope, but that decision ultimately, I don't know, it's life changing, obviously. But in that context of Joel, you have, I think, a lot of characteristics of his personality coming out ahead in that moment that lead up to that decision.
I also wanted to know, okay, so they do a lot of like mise en scène storytelling in the beginning of the game, which is to say that they dress the scene in a way that tells a story if you're willing to interact with it and look for the story. They I'm going to have to focus very specifically on Sarah's bedroom because I think it's one of the most
Mm.
beautifully designed rooms in the
Mm-mm.
game. But you see a lot of storytelling in Joel's house where it shows, interestingly, what's there is you see a lot of pictures of him and Sarah going on a cruise and them all going with Tommy. But it also says he's a construction worker, and he even comes in later and he's frustrated with a job where like a contractor or something like that has fallen through, and he's frustrated about it. You also see a lot of magazines strewn around for entrepreneurship so that he could create a startup and start his own business, more of a self-determination and taking control because he doesn't believe that he's getting where he is doing what he's doing. But I think that, like, up until the moment where Sarah is taken from him, he has operated within the confines of this regular path for a person of you do what's right and it will work out, and he's realizing that's not working for him. Then the soldier takes his daughter's life, and the social contract is officially broken in front of him. I think his background informs him at that moment that he needs to take advantage of the system because it's not working for him. I think it is because he was struggling as a construction worker and that giving him like the brawn they needed. I think all of these little character moments that they establish up until the moment Sarah's taken from informs that he will become a smuggler because that is where his skill set fits in after Sarah's taken and in a post-apocalyptic world. What do you
Tiny
think?
detail that adds to that is him asking Sarah where she got the money for the watch. Great detail, right? Because again, that tells a lot of story about their family life, about their financial situation. That tells a lot of story. I mean, kind of side question, where did she get the money for the watch? Like, Sarah...
She says she could drugs.
Right,
she sells hardcore drugs.
She lays it out right there.
Yeah.
And so she borrows the money.
So just with that, I want to just focus on that moment of banter between Sarah and Joel, because I think it's that banter that is the key to opening up Joel's heart for Ellie. They start to have this little banter. So in the TV show, that banter is there from day one with Ellie. And in the game, the first time I played it, I thought, oh yeah, that banter is there. Ellie is foul-mouthed, 14-year-old girl, does whatever she wants. But playing it through, she's actually pretty polite this first act. Then they start to get that banter, and then Ellie really takes on this, fills that Sarah-shaped hole in Joel's heart. But I think it's that banter that is laid out in that first sequence that gives us clues of how to get to Joel's heart. And it's not through his stomach. But I also think the show does a really good job at this, is there's so much more background to who Sarah is in the show. Like, it shows her going to the watch shop, going to school, all these little visiting the neighbors, and then it's really just setting the stage for those personality similarities between Sarah and Ellie, of where it just becomes a natural father-daughter relationship outside of just the, I guess not as a father-daughter relationship, but a Joel-Sarah type relationship with Joel and Ellie.
Speaking of that family relationship, I didn't remember, but I was looking for pictures, right, of Joel's ex, of mom, right, and why she's completely... There's none. There's no mention of her anywhere in the house. She's not in either of the bedrooms. She's not in a magnet on the fridge, like nowhere. Because you had asked this question, Shan, about like why not? Like, why is she nowhere in their lives? And I was grappling with that too, because going back and forth, did it just serve a purpose for Joel to make Joel seem more like the primary caretaker? Did it just up the ante and the stakes for him being a single father? Would it have weakened that impetus for him? They had beloved mother who had died prematurely of cancer or something. I was trying to figure that out. I don't know what your thoughts are about that, but
Yeah. I think that she was completely written out to inform Joel's character that the status quo for him in the prologue was he was completely satisfied with nothing else in his life except his daughter. He was fulfilled. And if you muddied that with a variable such as having had a wife, you kind of lose the significance that being a father is to Joel. And conversely, you never hear about Ellie's father, and it serves a similar but different purpose that I think it creates a blank slate of what a father is to Ellie, that you can then see that it is what Joel is, but you don't know that until it happens.
All right. So getting back to it, what does everybody think the watch symbolizes? I think it's a clean symbol that articulates a specific thing about Joel. What do you think?
I don't think it's an incredibly complicated symbol. I think it's a pretty, like, at least from a face value, it's pretty clearly symbolic of this is a gift that his daughter Sarah gave to him. This is something that was pure and innocent that he valued. And then when Sarah was taken from him, it was very visibly damaged. And so it's almost like an incredibly visual indicator of the damage that Joel carries around inside of him, as well as it's a reminder of his connection to Sarah and how she's gone. I know that's an incredibly obvious explanation.
There's an even more obvious part. Go for it.
I would say, yeah, taking that a step further, to me, just the way I'm viewing Joel this playthrough and through the show, that's when Joel's time stopped.
That's it.
It's a watch.
Oh,
A bullet hits the watch, it breaks it, and that's it. That's the quintessential lightning bolt in, what's that show? Back to the Future, hitting the tower, and it stops at the time, and that's
you have to think about it like this, right? 20 years in the future, he still wears the watch every day, even though it doesn't keep time. He has a literal item that shows him the exact second that his daughter died, because he has never stopped thinking about it, because that is the moment his life stopped.
Now, I think that's an interesting angle that I hadn't really considered. I like the idea of it being a timepiece, because it easily could have been a different gift that Sarah gave that got damaged or broken that he always kept on him. But a watch is time. His time stopped. A watch is also always visible on the character. It's on your wrist. You can see it all the time. It's not something that he'd have to pull out of his pocket and look at. It's something that he can carry with him always, and it's incredibly visible. So I think it's a really good visual indicator of that tragedy.
Interestingly enough, he tries to avoid the picture of his daughter. The contradiction that's inside of this character, where he wants to never forget the moment that was tragic to him and put him on the path of becoming a smuggler and going against the law. On the other hand, seeing his daughter is too painful for him and puts him in a very dark place. So it's almost like he's using the watch almost to motivate himself to go down the path he's going down, but he doesn't actually want to be in the stateful place he was with his daughter, because it's such a far split from where he was and where he is, that it's painful for him, because that delta is him with and without his daughter.
Yeah.
I also think with that, it's, to me, there's a disappointment I think Sarah would have in who Joel has become, because there's this, it's not just a father-daughter relationship. Sarah has this aspect of, she takes care of her dad. She's taking care of his birthday. On the show, she's making him breakfast, things like that. Whereas there's this kind of this reverse parenting, I'm not sure what you call it, but I think Joel is probably ashamed of who he's become, and looking at Sarah. The watch is, okay, I'm holding on to Sarah deep inside, but I don't have to confront the fact of who I've become all the time. But looking at Sarah, looking in her eyes, it's, oh my gosh, what have I become? She would be so disappointed in me. And so there's just kind of avoidance to it as well. I want to hold on to the good parts of how I feel, but also I want to avoid the consequences of who I've become.
You see a lot of that later, particularly way later in the story. And we won't talk about that now because it's so delicious. We'll just get to that. But Joel is pretty big on avoiding emotional conflict. Like when he meets Ellie, it's just nothing to do with you. Oh, we're smuggling a kid. Never mind. Don't want to do it. And even when he's there with
his
Tess,
brother.
and with his brother, because even when it's the three of them, Joel, Ellie, and Tess, Joel doesn't really interact with Ellie at all unless he has to. And then once Tess dies, that's when he finally starts to to talk to her. And it's out of necessity. It's not because he wants to. And so I think that picking up on that desire to avoid emotions and emotional conflict is pretty not immediately evident about Joel, but when you really look at the subtext, you can see that's a part of who he is.
It's the core personality trait of self-preservation, and he preserves himself through isolation, which is why he's never able to fully open up to Tess. It alludes that there could be a relationship, but if it was a normal, meaningful relationship, they probably just would have hit down the head, but they left it ambiguous because they wanted you to feel like there was always push and pull, but never commitment. All right, I really want to dig into why the settings matter, because I think that they lend themselves to the theme, but they also mechanically tell different parts of the journey of Joel's character development. So, as we know, the game starts in Austin, Texas. And Tucker, you lived in Austin for a couple of years or nearby. What do you think Texas tells us about Joel's character?
Luke alluded to it early, but I think just with Texas, there's this kind of old West mentality. We're self-sufficient. We're salt of the earth part of it. But in the context of The Last of Us, this is actually one part I've really struggled with of trying to figure out why Austin, why Texas, outside of just that surface level cowboy-esque that Joel has, this Lone Ranger type of personality being isolated. It's interesting because Joel's character, as we go along, there's aspects of it that are that, but then there's aspects that are not. Put Texas into a box in general, because I think there are, especially in Austin. Austin is, from a political standpoint, is the blue dot in Texas, and so there's that part of it that is a little bit interesting.
Yeah. But you also consider that I think it captures who Joel was. And so it doesn't necessarily show what he becomes, but there's this rugged individualism while still being passionate about family and community. And he has that at the beginning until it's taken from him. He's also not in Austin proper. He's on the outskirts. And that shows like you see in a lot of the pictures in their house, there's an outdoor like machismo about Joel that Austin captures the heart of. Why 20 years later, Joel is now in Boston? What does that do for his character? I think as artists, choosing Boston was definitely a backdrop that most starkly showed you the decay of society. And so it was really just like a visual storytelling technique to say that everything has fallen apart and we are able to show overgrowth in a way that we couldn't show out in the outskirts or along the journey. And so the contrast between Austin and Boston is stark for that reason. But also, I think Joel is in Boston not because he is turned institutionalist. I think it's because the social contract is broken and he is taking advantage of it. He is there to exploit the system because he hates them.
So just switching gears here on Boston, because I had an interesting thought. Boston is also the perfect backdrop for the Fireflies.
Tea
Boston
party
played
stuff.
such a pivotal, exactly, role in the American Revolution. And in essence, that's what the Fireflies are attempting to do. And Boston is the perfect backdrop for that. So I think there's this historical aspect of it as well. It's interesting because it's how many other actual intact quarantine zones are there. I think there's this aspect of Joel wanting to take advantage of the system, but I would think that would be pretty secondary to the self-preservation. So I picture Joel's
pragmatic.
backstory, is of jumping quarantine zone to quarantine zone, ending up in Boston. Boston has been safer. Later on in the game, end up coming across other quarantine zones that had been overrun. So it's really how many are left out there that are actual strong civilizations.
Right. He keeps wanting to go back to the quarantine zone because he's this reluctant hero or protagonist at the beginning. And the reason he wants to go back is not because he wants to contribute to a greater good or he believes in their authoritarian rule. It's because he thinks it's the safest way to survive. And so it's just practical.
Yeah, it's that survivalism. And again, just that desire to survive at all costs, the pragmatic, just get it done, stay alive. And he found a system in Boston that's, pretty easy or convenient for him to exploit it as a smuggler. That this is what I'm doing now. It's just, this is where I can do that. This is where I can survive.
Right. I also think visually it tells an important story of with all the brick structures and all of these taller facades. It's really a characterization of who Joel has become. Also has put up these barriers in his life and around him to protect himself. So going from Austin to Boston was really saying Joel is closed off from the world. He is as if the quarantine zone. He is trying to hide himself from the dangers of being outside of that protection.
So what's interesting with that analogy is even with all those walls, there's still ways in and out. And I think we see that with Joel's character as well. We see Tess has been able to find those secret tunnels to get Joel's
part of his job. He's a smuggler.
Just getting into holes. And exactly. But I think it's just like if Boston is representing Joel's personality and Joel's defense mechanisms, there's these big walls, but there's always ways around it. Ellie finds those ways around. Tess finds those ways around.
Yeah.
Tommy eventually does as well.
I wanted to ask about the museum because I think it tells the same story as Boston. They really wanted to hit home on the underlying tension between the Fireflies and Fedra is authoritarianism and democracy. And Boston's a perfect backdrop for that pivotal moment in American history where we also chose between democracy and tyranny. So I think it was really just elevating that underlying theme. Mechanically, it was brilliant to choose it because of the fragility of the items in it, right? Ellie bump into a glass vase and knock it over, and just like the tension that immediately stokes in you. And then you realize that you are surrounded by fragility. And so everything is a hazard, and you're afraid to take steps in there because you could start a chain of events that would be chaotic.
I really like the setting of the museum. I think that it's a really neat way, again, visually to represent something that used to be beautiful and ornate and important. And once society and individuals shift from like a comfort level that they had in 2013 before the infection spread across the world, people were able to be comfortable and pursue things that made them happy and to catalog artifacts from before and look at museums and recreate, basically. And humanity is in survival mode now. And when that happens, value shifts. Things that used to have value don't have value anymore. Things in museums used to have value for people because there was historical significance. But then once humanity shifts into survival mode, none of that matters anymore. It's just another building. It's another hidey hole, like you were saying. And I think part of that is just another way for them to show the world shifting its priorities and shifting into chaos, as well as it being a really nice visual indicator of the lost artificial beauty, making way for natural beauty. Because even though the world is being overtaken and overgrown and reverting back, there's still plenty of moments of natural beauty, particularly playing the remake version of the game where you sit back and you're like, this looks amazing. And then you turn a corner and it's horrifying again. It's such a cool balance of like back and forth between natural beauty and natural horror, juxtaposed against what used to be an artificial beauty. And the museum illustrates that point really well.
Okay, to backtrack a little bit, before you get to the museum, you go through the tilted building. Now, I think this is one of the most powerful visual settings in the game, even though the building itself is largely without significance. You get to see that the most powerful structures, they didn't just fall over and collapse in on themselves. It is a very powerful way of saying everything is in decay, and it is decaying. It's losing its foundation. It's falling into another building. That's something that this story could say with its setting that maybe other post-apocalyptic games couldn't, due to nuclear war or whatever. Everything would have collapsed on itself. So it was just like a very unique way for an artist to show what this post-apocalyptic world looks like as opposed to any other. But also the loss of control and the tilted building, it took away a horizontal perspective. The entire time you're in that building, you are always adjusting for that askewed camera. And that is what adds to the underlying tension of the entire scene. So it was just a brilliant way to dress the entire setting by taking away one element of control from you.
I caught myself when I was playing that part of the game without realizing I was leaning sideways on the couch and I didn't even, and then I was like,
Developers didn't account
my
for
head.
that.
No, and I realized that's why I was doing that is because the building is like this. And I was like, oh, I just got to line that up there without even realizing it. I did that, just stretch it. Yeah. Yeah, it's just so cool how that game, like a really effective atmosphere, a really effective game can make you behave a different way in the real world. I catch myself doing things like that over and over again playing this game.
Platformers, I always tense my back on every jump as if I am end the game. Tucker, I believe you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I just think this is maybe no longer relevant, but just on that same point, you're making Shan of just adding tension. That's one of the things that stood out to me and just throughout the whole game, just your traverse. There's no straight road and there's always getting lost. Like, where do I go a lot of the times? And I think that's one of those things that throughout the game, especially in The Last of Us Part 2 and later on in this game, where there's enemies chasing you, you have to run, but you don't have a lay of the land. And there's no,
It's not railroading
obvious.
you in a direction.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so I just love that because to me, it adds a lot of tension into the overworld of things. In the quarantine zones, for the most part, you're on streets, you're on sidewalks. It's easy to follow. But as soon as you get into the real world, you're jumping over rubble, having to, especially in the tilted building, you're going up and down different staircases. You're getting disoriented of where you are in this tilted structure, not just because of the tiltiness, but because of the vertical changes you need to make.
Yeah, so the brilliance of the game design that you'll see throughout this game and The Last of Us Part 2 is that all of these scenes, they really still have the same variables. They have the same kind of enemies. And then they say, what if we took away one thing from you? What does this level look like? So like in The Last of Us Part 2, I'm suddenly thinking of there's this area that has a pool of water that you're trudging around in the entire time. So at that time, they're taking away speed from you. And then they say, if we change one variable of control, how do you respond to it? And because you're not used to it, you haven't done it yet, you are going to be tense. And so every level is designed to take away one element of control. In a similar way, I'm thinking of Hellblade, where it's like each of these segments that you're in this journey, it's I'm going to take away your eyesight or I'm going to take away your hearing. They're always taking something from you so that you're scared.
Yeah. Keep you on your toes.
Similarly, in that tilted building, we also for the first time encounter, I think, is it both runners and clickers, or is it just clickers for the first time?
I think it's clickers for the first time.
But we do have runners.
Yeah, because you've seen runners before.
There's a very short window before you get to the building where it foreshadows the clicker screeching. That is one of my favorite moments in the early game.
So good.
There is a video that specifically talks about where they place it. There's just only a couple voice actors that really figure out the formula. And they're the same ones that they end up using in the show. And they use the same actors that were doing the physical motions to portray the clickers in the show, which is a real dedication to like the craft of the game and the show. I also love how it, like the way that they captured it in your headspace when using headphones. It's reverberating around the whole city. You're not safe anymore. It surrounds you. Danger is everywhere now. It's a clicker for the first time. And here it showcases like the perfect formula for the tension release cycle. So first you get the foreshadowing of the sound that the clicker makes. And then you start getting, it builds the atmosphere. You're seeing the building in decay. You're feeling a lot more claustrophobic. The music changes, the mood changes. Then they show a clicker embedded in the wall so that you can yourself zoom in and out with the camera and inspect what your danger is going to be, which is interesting because a lot of times horror is withholding information.
Well, and they make you interact with the clicker too. It's blocking a doorway and Joel has to pop it open and move it to the side to get through the door.
I think that was an interesting choice, but it really also allowed them to demonstrate that this is a different thing from the runners. And this is your biggest threat, or at least it'll be your most regular threat. But you realize that this isn't the same thing as a zombie. This is where we are going to distinguish ourselves from the zombie genre. They're gorgeous. I think they're showing off.
They're peacocks.
They are, 100%.
Just going off of that, as clickers in general throughout the game, you can get really close to them and then not kill you, but you're playing with fire because you take one wrong step, make a little too much noise as you're crouching, and it's turning on you. And so there's this idea of clickers, you're playing with fire, is you can try to extinguish all of them in whatever type of combat setting you're in, or you can try to sneak around. And it's just very, I don't know, it's especially depending on the level of difficulty. That's why I love this game. You can go guns blazing if you want. Wouldn't recommend that strategy just because resources are so
Run out of
scarce.
bullets real fast.
Or you can go sneaking around in this more Assassin's Creed approach where you're sneaking, stealth-killing, or you can just avoid combat altogether and get out.
Yeah. At this point, imagine you're playing it for the first time. You still don't know how the clickers move and how they're distinguished from runners. You've just seen it. And so it's still withholding information from you. It's just saying, we have a new enemy for you and you don't know what to expect. So there's still like this very visceral fear that you have. You're like, this is terrifying to look at. I don't want to encounter this. But then I think you open the door and you knock over something to another floor, and you're like, well, shoot, it's all over. And then it takes a cinematic so that it can really frame the horror as like a real one attacks you. So you can get a real close up of how these creatures move. It was an interesting choice to go to cinematic in QuickTime event, but I think that was because the director wanted to force you to have a specific framing. I wanted to talk about that. I was also taken by Sarah's vantage point in the truck because you get a much smaller aspect ratio of the horror and you're not in control of the truck. Putting you in Sarah's perspective, there's a lot of tension of I can't control things. And then immediately after the truck is hit, you are then jumped into Joel's body, but you immediately can't pick up a weapon because Sarah's ankle is broken. So they're taking away the control you would otherwise have with having a weapon. They keep taking things from you. I thought this was interesting. I noticed this game design in the building where, yes, you're meeting clickers for the first time, but you still have runners. A lot of times, like when you meet, I think, stalkers for the first time, it's just stalkers. But when you meet clickers, you also have runners. And then I realized you usually have runners with clickers. And I think that was an intentional design to force the player, if they make one single mistake, to suddenly be swarmed. What do you think?
Well, that's something that I experienced every time I play this game, but particularly this time, because a little bit later, I guess if it's a room full of like just clickers, you can pretty easily like one by one pick them up if you have enough shivs or if you've got like a good enough aim, because they can't see you. They're blind. You shoot one, you shiv one, and then you run around a corner 2 times and you be quiet, and then they forget where you are, and then you can step on the next one. But if you mix the runners into the mix there as well, they can see. And if one of them sees you, they're going to make a lot of noise. And then the clicker's on you like that. And so I almost had with that first real encounter with that one clicker, and there's 4 or 5 runners in the slanted building. I had more problems with the runners because I had a hard time picking them off quietly without them alerting the clicker who came in to cause problems for. So I agree. A super smart game design to make you think about like, how do I tackle this situation? Because you can go in gun blazing, but at this point of the game, you don't have a lot of ammo. You don't have a lot of shivs. And so it forces you to try to think about how you're going to interact with these enemies. And I think it's just good game design to teach you to be careful with your resources, to be careful with how you approach situations. Just smart game design. Love it.
I've never done a scene perfectly. I will always trigger at least 1 or 2 runners or clickers.
Yeah.
Like there's always one variable that I'm not thinking about, one direction I'm not looking.
Yeah, I want to bounce off of that just with sound and light. One thing I thought was really interesting just on this, the different enemies you encounter in this first act is infected. They don't see light. So you can have your flashlight on all you want. NBD, yeah, it adds a little bit of control. But to Shan's point, when you're fighting Fedra in a darkened space, you can't have your flashlight on. They're going to see you. So you're taking away your visuals there. And so it's different enemies with different tensions.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting thing. Fedra's not necessarily going to swarm you, but they're smarter. They're going to see certain things. They're going to notice certain things. Where infected, you can stealth kill an infected, not worry about the body. But when you stealth kill a Fedra agent, you're now like hyper aware of where this body is, making sure nobody comes across it because you don't want to set off the alarm.
If you also noticed, when you're against Fedra, you can crouch, walk at full speed. You can't do that with clickers. You have to do half crouch speed.
Because they'll hear you. Yep.
Yeah. They have a heightened sense.
Piggybacking off of what Tucker said, there's not a huge variation of enemy types in this game. But what they do is they take that relatively small number of different enemy types, and the way that they mix those enemy types together with different other enemy types, as well as different environments, makes almost every encounter feel really unique and really like you have to tackle it a different way. It's hard to do the exact same methods for multiple encounters because they do a good job at mixing different enemy types and different environments together.
It wasn't until like a few years ago I realized that some of these horror games get away with 5 enemies. And I just don't think about it. Sometimes it's like it's a zombie, then it's a zombie on fire, so they barely have to tweak the AI. But the reason that they're able to get away from that is because the level design says, let's try these 2 together, let's try these 2 together. let's put it in this different layout. Let's do this layout. So it's never the same combination of variables. So you always have to think of it in a different way.
Which I think is for me why these games get emotionally exhausting, because there's a lot of planning. That means kind of outside just the surface level emotional content, it's a lot of energy to be put into a game. It's not necessarily a casual game you play. It's not, let me flip this on for 15 minutes to half an hour, have some fun, and then leave. It's you get invested, you get sucked in for a while, and it's a continuous story. There's no, hey, you're on to the next level. It's a cutscene, environment changes a little bit, and you are still moving through and you're still sucked in, which I love.
And I'm never itching for more action. I'm never like, get this story out of the way. Like, get this story out of the way. I want to shoot more zombies. I'm always like, I want to know what's going to happen next. The combat and gameplay is excellent, but I'm way more invested in the story. Where the story is the crux of this game. I'm not saying it's anything that people don't know. It's a great story.
The show does that so well. I was shocked how little cordyceps encounters there were, while still capturing the same feeling. And I think it's this human story. Cordyceps are there. They're a tool every now and again to showcase the world they're living in and how fragile humanity is, how fragile our human psyche can be. Talking about emotional walls we put up, they're a tool used in that. But the show, just there's so many great points in that. We're going to talk about it later. But the Bill episode is probably one of the best love stories I've ever seen, ever. And it is just so well done. And there's no zombie encounter, but it's one of the most perfect stories, and you're so invested. But I think that's just that's his flavor. It's just this really great storytelling across the board.
Circle back to one of the original things I was talking about, the tension release cycle. After you get through this buildup of tension, then a climax of tension, then you go into a downbeat. And this is something that I feel like Resident Evil perfected. And it's what The Last of Us really built on, which is the reason that horror lends so well with puzzles or with collecting items and all of that stuff is because it gives you a moment to breathe and relax before they start reintroducing those variables that build up the tension again. But what The Last of Us does better than something like a Resident Evil is that they give you characters so that you can be doing the mechanical of collecting bullets while also getting story development and also hearing exposition. This horror game works because on those downbeats, the story is so compelling that you want to live in those downbeats, and it is just as rewarding as the action.
Yeah, I get really giddy whenever I see the little speech bubble with triangle next to it. I'm just like, oh, I'm going to get some more stories. Some more
Story. I
interaction.
love it.
There's never a wasted scene. Yeah. And like, even with the encounters, something that this game does better than most action games is that it's never just an action sequence for the sake of action. It is always adding nuance to characterization. For example, you get in a scuffle with Fedra, and that reveals that Ellie has been bitten, and it shows how she would react in such a situation. Then you have Joel with skepticism that she is actually immune. And then you get into an encounter where that is challenged, and you see where his character is at and where Ellie's character is at, provides a new layer of meaning to how you interact with that encounter. So every single encounter is not wasted. You're in the museum, and that is where the story moves forward, that Tess has been bitten, although surreptitiously. So she suddenly becomes a lot more guarded because she doesn't want to admit at that point that she has died. Then go to the Capitol, and she reveals that it's over for her. But like, every action sequence isn't just an action sequence. And that is why that is just as interesting. Whereas I might get bored with something like Call of Duty, where it's just action, no character development. I didn't get the chance to ask yet, but why do you play as Sarah first? And I think it's because you don't have Joel's brawn. And it's a loss of control. It's tension, person and third person perspective, seeing both angles of him, and you really value his traits, and then you want to body. And we haven't really dug into my favorite setting, which is the first 10 seconds of the game, you're in Sarah's room and you're not supposed to think anything of it. You're just supposed to leave. It is like bed to door 10 seconds. But I spent more time in that room than anywhere in the game in the prologue and first act. Who else took the time to explore that room?
This time I did. You had mentioned that you had started playing it and you were like, I spent some time looking around the room. So I was like, I'm going to do that too. And so following to it, like, yeah, spend some time in this room. Let's see what's going on in there.
All right. So what did people catch?
On a very surface level, I feel like you've hinted a little bit here and there, Shan, that there's a lot of foreshadowing for what happens later in the game. I noticed that there was a giraffe in there. I noticed that Sarah's a big soccer fan, which I think that we're going to have a scene in the chapters coming up that kind of that's hinted at. But the giraffe was one of the big things that jumped out at me. Also, that Dawn of the Wolf poster on the wall, which Ellie references many chapters down. But there's a lot of little things in there. The giraffe is a very surface level one. If you played the game once before and then you play it again and you're in Sarah's room, you're like, hey, a giraffe.
So we get the guitars, which we've already talked about, where you can infer that Joel is teaching Sarah how to play guitar, which takes on more meaning when he realizes Ellie has an interest in music, which really adds meaning to when he realizes he could connect to Ellie in the same way. You see the giraffe, which foreshadows the moment that they encounter the giraffe in the final act, where Joel takes on the persona of being her father because he gets to take care of her. So he's already adopted that mantle. He then sees Ellie get excited about the giraffe. He remembers Sarah loves giraffes. So it's not just a beautiful moment of her finding humanity that she seemed to have lost months before. It's also at every moment in this story, she has demonstrated in some way that she shares all of the same interests as his daughter that he was able to connect with her and then to Ellie. What else was it? Oh, there was a ton of books on the supernatural. There were books about ghosts. There was a giant poster of a werewolf movie. Now, this foreshadows the DLC of Ellie going to the mall with Riley because they go to a Halloween shop and she loves Halloween. She very specifically puts on a wolf mask. Now, Joel doesn't get to see this. So this is just for the audience, but it's nodding to like literally every interest that she has is the same. But to that point, how are Sarah and Ellie different?
One of the biggest obvious differences is they come from completely different worlds. Sarah died before the world went crazy. She didn't get to see any of that. She was part of the normal world. She grew up a normal kid. She went to school. She had friends. She listened to music. She was probably a pretty happy, normal kid. Was born into a nightmare. She's never known normalcy. So it's 20 years later and she's 14. So she was born 6 years in after all of this, like the world went to hell. So Ellie doesn't have that connection to any kind of normalcy. She's grown up in an insane world and that's all she knows. And so I think that while she shares a lot of traits with Sarah, there's a softness that Sarah has that Ellie can never have because she just doesn't have that connection to a more controlled world.
I just remembered another one. There's a giant poster of all the planets.
Yep.
And
I was going to
as
say
we all
that.
know,
Yep.
Ellie is obsessed with space. And this becomes one of the most important scenes, I think, in The Last of Us 2, where they do a flashback and it shows them in a museum. But the most meaningful moment is when he takes Ellie on this imagined space ride. These are all moments that he wanted with his daughter, and he's reliving with Ellie. So the biggest contrast between the two, Sarah and Ellie, is like the softness between a hard exterior. But I think the most important thing for people to notice is that Sarah is who Joel was, and Ellie is who Joel becomes. And he just has to bridge the gap on realizing that this is who he can now be a father to. When he realizes she checks all the other boxes, she does everything that Sarah otherwise would have loved, but Ellie now represents who he is now and accepts him for who he is now. And once he's able to take out all other variables, he's left with a reflection of himself. And that's when he wants to be her father.
Do we do it?
Did we do it? Did we do podcasts?
I think we did it.
I think, yeah, I don't have anything particular to add. I'm excited to talk about the next few episodes. We get into some cool stuff there.
At the end of the act that we played, the first act, we see a note in the sewers while we're carrying Ellie along because she can't swim. We see a note that says Frank is trying to get into the quarantine zone. So there's a lot of behind the scenes storytelling that they do to build up to what Bill is. But as we know, it's completely different from the show. We're going to focus more on the show because it tells a much bigger story in one of the most impressive stories in television history. But we will try to tackle why the game is different and how they both still tell the same thematic elements and elevate the purpose of the story.
Super excited. Bill is one of my favorite characters in the game and portrayed very well in the show, but it's such a fun part of the game. I'm excited to dig into it, talk about it.
Actually, a lot of these things later, but we know that this is a Craig Mazin masterpiece because this is where it diverged the most from the game and told a whole different story. But has anybody here seen Mythic Quest? Just Tucker?
You've been telling me to, but I haven't.
Well, oh my gosh, go watch Mythic Quest. It's amazing.
I know.
Rob,
I just haven't. I too many shows on my list.
Henny from It's Always Sunny, Mac, he leads this game development studio, and they have a bunch of B-list actors in the story, and Craig Mazin is one of those characters, and he plays a QA developer. And there's a girl in it who is the main character from Forbidden West. And she's like an actress in a bunch of mainstream games similar to Troy Baker. So he's constantly pulling these veterans from the gaming industry into this show. But, I remember what it is. Craig Mazin plays himself. It plays his own father in the show. And his father is a storyteller and he writes books. And he's really annoying. He's like one of those, I'm going to correct your grammar all the time. I think they just let him be who he probably is in real life. But if you listen to the Last of Us podcast between him and Neil Druckmann and sometimes Troy Baker, it's those two talking. And he's the one that helped adapt and direct the TV show. He also did Chernobyl, which is another one of the greatest dramas ever made. So you really get a sense of when he's talking, he's one of the smartest people I've ever heard speak. He's very insightful and he cares about these characters as if they're real. And he talks about them as if they're real and he can still be surprised by them. So even though he's directing them and he's writing them, he watches the show and he keeps finding new things that he's not realizing. He's, I think the character's thinking this. And it really humanizes and like paints it with this realistic brush of he's just telling a real story. He cares that much about the medium, a fascinating listen. Another point I was going to make is that Mythic Quest did the same thing where they have one episode that stands out and it's a vignette of characters and it's played by Nick Miller from New Girl, Jake Johnson, and who's the woman? Is it Kristen Milioti?
Yes.
From How I Met Your Mother, the mother.
And Palm Beach, if you've ever watched Palm Beach.
And
highly recommend
musicals, as Luke would know. It's like, it's not even characters that are talked about ever again in the show. They just go into the past and they say, these are these two characters' story about how they tried to create a studio and why they failed. And that studio ends up becoming the studio that Mythic Quest is based in. But you have to ask yourself, similar to Bill and Frank, is why disrupt the pace of the show to insert a complete vignette that doesn't seem to add to the story? But in another way, it is the entire show. It's the thesis of the show. So I'm going to dig into that next time.
Cool.
That's one hell of a cliffhanger.
Yeah. Cliffhanger. Outro. Bleep-a-doof, bleep-a-deep, bloop-a-dee-blow.